Good afternoon, and our final speaker in this session is Michael.
Thank you very much.
And Michael is an independent music researcher and currently works at the Sydney Libraries. And his paper covers his personal reflections of collecting, researching and reissuing music in Australia's music and recorded sound history. So,
Thank you very much. Yeah, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, I pronounce that right, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting, and I pay respects to elders both past, present and future. Okay, so this paper is just generally on how and why I collect. Although I collect a wide range of media, including vinyl LPs, audio cassette, CDs, digital files, especially for the digital reissue projects, sheet music and ephemera, my main focus is the 7/8 RPM gramophone disc, which you can see there, the 10-inch example there, and the music of its era, which spans from around 1900 up until about 1958, when 78s were no longer mass-produced. And I think the term forgotten sounds in my title of my presentation applies to much of the written material in this area, especially Australian recordings. But I won't be talking much about the actual content of my research, but I'll just give a quick outline of just the general areas that I'm interested in. Includes Australian sound recordings in general, discography, Greek music in particular, the genres Rebetika and Cyrenaica, and I'm very interested also in the aspects of queer culture in the music of Rebetika. Aboriginal music, Maori music, Hawaiian style music, especially as a popular genre, Pacific choral music, popular music in general, coon songs, minstrelsy, and race and representation in general in popular music. But if you want to know more about my sort of curation research activities, this is my blog, Amnesiac Archive. It's an amnesiac, which is quite, I'm not going to elaborate on that, which is just amnesiac-archive.com. And I'll provide a link for that later on as well. So I'll provide the first half of the paper to talking about the question of why I collect the material that I do. And it's also similar to the process that Matt Finch talked about yesterday about narrating the experience of the research. And the second half will deal mostly with my personal methodology for how I like to use or how we should use or situate these sound recordings in their appropriate context. Through curating exhibitions like this one I did last year in Leichhardt in Sydney, and also blog writing and blog posts. This is an article on the Rotorua Maori Choir that was published on the New Zealand audio blog, sound music blog Audio Culture. That was based on a larger, more extensive article I wrote for the Discographer magazine. And the point I'd like to get across in this presentation as well is that idea of the reissue process and the idea of the reissue package, and I'll talk about that later. And then this will lead into just general discussion and conjecture around the importance of sound recordings as a living history and why we should do more to share and disseminate them. But to introduce you into the weird and wacky and wonderful world of 78 collecting, I'll just play this clip from the 2001 film Ghost World, directed by Terry Zwigoff. Steve Buscemi plays the role of Seymour, who's the archetypal obsessive collector.
Are all these records?
I've got about 1,578 at this point. I try to pare down my collection to just the essential.
Look at this room. This is like my dream room. Look at all this stuff. You are like the luckiest guy in the world. I would kill to have stuff like this.
Please, go ahead and kill me.
Oh, come on. What are you talking about?
Well, you think it's healthy to obsessively collect things? You can't connect with other people, so you fill your life with stuff. Just like all the rest of these pathetic collector losers.
So there you go. That popular perception is quite does proliferate, but collectors can do more than just be record nerds and accumulate and obsess over their holdings. The legendary compilation album, The Anthology of American Folk Music, which was first released by Folkways Records in 1952, is a very good example of how a collector can weave together objects, or in this case sounds, music, that are otherwise disconnected in time and place, to see how they fit into the grand and esoteric narratives of history. And the person behind this compilation was Harry Everett Smith, eccentric collector, born 1923, died 1991. He was the compiler, or I would argue curator more like, of this 3-volume 6 LP set. And he accomplishes this task through an alchemical blending of folk, blues, country, and rural music issued on 7/8 RPM discs during the period of 1927 to 1932. And this was a very influential release. At the time of its release, most of the recordings that Harry Smith personally compiled to the album were pretty much forgotten, like all those recordings of Middle America and folk music. He sort of spearheaded that whole reissue process. And in 1991, a few days before his death, he received a Grammy Award. I think it was actually a Lifetime Achievement Award, but I'm not sure exactly. He proclaimed when he got up on the stage in his very sort of frail state that his dream had come true, that he literally saw America change through music. And Smith's work, most importantly, shows that a collector can do more than just endlessly hoard material. They can be alchemists, they can be creators, and they can also be curators. Now, Roy Sugar, in his study Wax, Trash and Vinyl Treasures, Record Collecting as a Social Practice, argues for the idea of collecting as an actual career. And he even writes that collecting is central to the construction and expression of personal identity. And in the book, he goes on to even outline a typical career progression of a record collector. So to explain to you why I collect, I need to give you a few personal details and backgrounds. So I was born in Sydney, Australia, and grew up during the early 2000s. And from the ages of 5 to about 12, I witnessed the demise of audiovisual formats like the VHS tape. I remember watching all those Disney movies on VHS. And I also saw the rise of MP3s, iTunes, and digital audio players. And in 2005, my sister and I begged my mother to buy us the newest Apple iPod minis on the market. Well, obviously gender roles, like I chose the blue one, she chose that one. But they retailed at around $300 each at the time, and they had a storage capacity of 4 gigabytes, which was touted as storing about 1,000 songs. And to give you a comparison, 4 gigabytes on a USB today would only cost you a few dollars, and they don't even make them anymore because they've got bigger sizes. So go figure. But the iPod was a revelation for me at the time. It was much sleeker, it was lighter, and it was, to be honest, a lot more sexier than a CD Walkman. And it also gave me the ability to curate my listening experience in a very eclectic and erratic manner, or you could call it postmodern, pomo. And because at the touch of a button on that click wheel, I could be listening to a violin concerto by Vivaldi, for instance, and with another swipe on that click wheel and click, I could be listening to a rap song by Eminem. So it's very postmodern like that. But from this initial amazement that I had then and even now at how far we've come in terms of technology in the 21st century, also came a desire to regress back into the past. Around 12 years old, I bought my first record player, and I started playing the few old Greek LPs that my parents had in the basement, which was sitting on a pile of rubbish. And then I got into the habit of going to Salvos, Vinnie's, charity stores, picking up these $2 LPs. And in a further descent into obscurity, or madness, whichever term you prefer, I became enraptured with the different world of sound offered by the 78 gramophone disc. Now, I was initially lured into these recordings, especially Greek music, that collectors have uploaded of their own holdings on YouTube or made available on blogs like Excavated Shellac, run by Jonathan Ward, as well as official reissue albums on iTunes, CDs, not Spotify, but yeah. And then at the age of 16, I wrote a novella based loosely on the life of the Greek singer Marika Babagiga. She's over there in that photo. Who had a prolific recording career that lasted from 1919 to 1929 in New York City. And the project was an personal attempt, at trying to reconcile the little information we know about her life with the story she so rightfully deserved as one of the first pioneering Greek women to be heard on record. But in any case, the project was a bit of a failure. But it was more about it triggered something. And I realised now there was probably more a desire to make sense of my own Greek background and see where everything fits and makes sense in my personal narrative. And what that triggered was that desire to start thinking locally and digging deeper. And I had to find a context for my writing and also collecting activities that made sense for my own time and place. And as soon as these questions surfaced, and if you have a curious mind, one thing leads to another, I only dug myself deeper into the collecting rabbit hole. These questions and doubts led to even further re-evaluation. For instance, I was initially fascinated by the vinyl LP, as I said, and its relatively new way of listening. But this gave way to concerns around the consumerist implications of this format fetishism. I thought, well, what was the point of buying an album on LP by my favourite artists, the Rolling Stones or the Stooges or Iggy Pop or whatever, just to have it on vinyl, when I already had a CD or digital copy on hand. So it was a bit of an absurd moment. I thought, well, what's the point? But as my music interest kept expanding, I noticed the existence of sounds that were tracked on their old analog format like vinyl that I couldn't seem to find anywhere else, on iTunes, on CD, on YouTube. And then with this realisation, I sort of noticed, oh well, maybe there is more to be discovered, maybe there is more to be unearthed. And maybe there were more sounds that had been pushed to the periphery that needed to be heard. Part of the entry into the book Sexing the Groove, Popular Music and Gender, Will Straw commented on the tendency of record collectors to valorise the obscure. So perhaps my interest in the marginal was just a sign of my increasing record mania, rather than any personal or unique epiphany. But alongside this obscurist tendency was a curiosity in the music and recorded sound heritage of my birth country, Australia. And Richard Spotswood's landmark discography, Ethnic Music on Records, drew my attention to the thousands upon thousands of foreign language recordings made in America during the 70 RPM era. Well, it's not actually, I think the discography cuts off at 1942 or something, basically. And I thought, well, did Australia have this legacy? And if not, why? And along the way, I corresponded with a lot of individuals, collectors, academics, researchers, sound engineers, historians, and enthusiasts both locally and that I've actually personally met, as well as online through email correspondence. And I also became aware at the time of the great work being done in the field that has been done already in the field by dedicated individuals like the late Mike Sutcliffe, Chris Long, Ross Laird, among others. I could go on. But there were still some gaps in what had been covered and what hadn't. And a lot of what had been covered in terms of the reissue process weren't available really at all. And more concerning, when I started experiencing some personal contacts and the stories they said, they were quite disparaging of institutions. Well, the institution they had the most vitriol for was the National Film and Sound Archive. Sort of failure to support research into Australia's recorded sound history, or at least make their holdings more available to the public or researchers. So if you want to access the material, of course, they don't send you a link online or a digital file. You have to actually go into their service centres in Sydney. And although you might think, oh, okay, well, fair enough, that it needs to be protected. Recently, I was in contact with the Ngā Taonga Sound Archives in New Zealand, and I expressed my interest in cassette tape monologue of a Maori choir member for these recordings I was researching, and they were more than happy to just send me the link online. And I was like, oh wow, this is a change. It was quite a shock actually, just how I didn't have to pay any access fees, I didn't have to pay any usage fees. Of course, usage fees obviously have their own cost, but just to access it online is just incredible. And actually digitised a film in their collection of the Maori choir expedition that wasn't available online already. They said, oh, okay, well, we already have a digital copy, but we need to make another transfer. And they did that for free. And I have a digital link that I can view for around 6 weeks. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But perhaps this cultural cringe is to blame for the ignorance and apathy to acknowledge and preserve our sound history, especially the early days. And the uncomfortable truth with Australian commercial sound recordings, especially during the 7/8 RPM era, is that there simply isn't really much of it. And a lot of what was made here doesn't really compare to the diversity and volume of other countries that obviously had sound recording earlier, like America and Europe. For example, there were more Hawaiian-style recordings made in Greece than there were in Australia during the 7/8 RPM era, which is just gives you an idea of how small the market was for local Australian content. And part of the problem was, again, the small size, but it was also due to the extremely conservative music tastes of the record-buying public. And of course, record-buying public means people who could afford to access them. And this tricky business environment made it very difficult for record companies to take creative as well as financial risks on what they chose to not only record, but also reissue commercially. And yeah, it would have been great if we had more material to draw upon, like Harry Smith did with his anthology of Aboriginal gumleaf bands, or Banjo Patterson reciting his own verse on record, or Polynesian choirs, or rural bush bands, or more folksier, stringy, rootsy sort of music. But however entertaining these fantasies may be, we've got to accept what we have. And if we all internalise this cultural cringe, both at a personal and institutional level, then we risk losing, or even worse, forgetting, the heritage that we do have. And what about our links to the broader oceanic region? What about recordings that don't necessarily fit into the quintessential idea of what is Australian or not, like music for Maori and Hawaiian style music that was recorded here, or recordings that shed light on our historically uncomfortable relationship with things like race, gender, sexuality, political correctness, and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And as I started delving in more into the history of sound recordings, these are the questions that not only provided me the impetus for why I should collect the material that I do, but what I should collect, but more importantly, why. And in 2015, what sort of began this process was an exhibition I curated at Surrey Hills Library in Sydney as part of my traineeship. And it was based on the local record and gramophone industry during the Roaring 20s, and there was about 30 locked display cases in that full of material. You can see all the photos on my blog, I'm not going to go on about that. But the exhibition and mounting it was a good exercise in collecting and curating. But I came to realise along the way how actually integrated these processes are, particularly for me personally. And so, because to properly curate this exhibit, I had to amass as much material as possible to see patterns and connections between objects, which is a similar process to what Harry Smith did. But to efficiently collect the material, I needed to use my curatorial judgment to set parameters on what does or doesn't need to be included, what is irrelevant or relevant. But to simplify my approach into easier terms, I saw collecting as accumulation and curation as sense-making, and they were both necessary and interdependent processes. Now, there are other ways of presenting content that don't involve plotting out objects or things in an exhibition space, a 3D space. And over time, I became less preoccupied with presenting and curating the actual physical artefact. Instead, the sounds and music took priority. But how could I really curate this content, which essentially today means just digital files, in a way that was appropriate? Well, I could easily share sound recordings on YouTube, of course, but I found this method wasn't really official or even legal, really. And content just tended to sit there without attaining any permanency or context for it to be valued or appreciated. I know Peter Miller talked a bit yesterday about the album as a very antiquated way of curating. What I understand his approach from the work he does as a sound artist, creative practitioner, and the importance of reusing material from the archive, public domain, etc., it really isn't a good approach for putting, recording historical works of art, music or film in their proper context in a way they can be appreciated as on their own as works. For example, Miller mentioned the horror film House on Haunted Hill, and he liked the public domain version because it was, the film print showed more signs of age. And while this aesthetic is fine for creative repurposing, it is really inappropriate for experiencing and appreciating the film as an entire work or composition. I think it actually has been professionally released from whoever owns the original camera negative anyway. But yeah, it's just merit works of art that merit proper treatment. But at the same time, through that discovery process, I became very envious of the work being done in America by reissue labels or independent record labels like Dust to Digital in the United States, who repackage and reissue historical recordings of blues, gospel, country, and world music, including this set dedicated to Southeast Asian recordings from the 7.5 PM era. And they had superb audio restoration and lavish packages full of images and scholarly annotations. And the success of the model is apparent through through the awards they've won, Grammy Award nominations, the backlog of literature and reviews praising their work, and also that their official Facebook page has over 200,000 likes, which goes to show the type of engagement of their audience. And what the Dust to Digital sort of example proves, well, one, professionally produced reissue packages like that are very costly and time-consuming, but they succeed at captivating certain audiences who would not otherwise be interested in the material. And although vast sound archives of 78s are becoming available, most notably most recently through the Internet Archive, they can be quite overwhelming for the casual listener, even me who likes researching this sort of stuff. And just like physical archives and repositories of sound media, material just tends to sit there, only this time it is on a digital shelf and not a physical one. And reissue projects do more than keep recordings in print. They make the sounds and music of the past more digestible, more current, and more relevant. And I'll just quickly give an outline of two general ways you can compile an album of 78 recordings. One is what I dub the discographic approach or completist approach, which focuses on presenting the entire recorded output or near complete output of a certain artist, vocalist, group, composer, song, or even recording session. But then there's the mixed bag approach or the eclectic approach, where the compiler makes a selection of recordings based on a unifying theme or concept, which can involve a geographic location, like Jonathan Moore did for his set on African 78s, or just a location, style of music, period, or just general concept album, almost. But this process is complicated even further by considering how listeners consume and digest the music. Will they listen to it all in one go? Or will they do what my 8-year-old self did and what most people do now, just erratically dip in and out of tracks, rendering the compiler's careful selection completely useless? But the basic concept, I think, to take behind this approach is the idea of a package, which I talked about before, which is a curated, resolved, well-researched and integrated whole that features high-quality cover art, design, sound restoration, liner notes, attention to detail with the research. And I find that this curatorial approach mimics the physical site of an exhibition space, but for sound recordings. And of course, objects can be placed in a space that suggests a narrative for the audience to follow, but is never as strict or didactic as a text like a book or a film where you're meant to sit, you're meant to read it in order. Because when you're in an exhibition space, you don't really consume it in a linear way, nor you're expected to, nor do you need to. You can sort of meander around the space, engage with some works, pull out, go back in, read a bit, come back, or even come back later on. So, and this way the viewer or listener has control over how they experience a content, and it's a site that they can visit, and every time they visit or access or read or listen, they do it in a way that gives them the most enjoyment and most importantly meaning. But unlike an exhibition which is usually fixed or temporal, the reissue package can function as a physical site, as I said, that audiences can return to over and over and over. But in practice, there are many hurdles and barriers along the way to reissuing archival sound recordings. One of the problems is that reissue work done by record labels is considered a commercial enterprise. Although that term is really a misnomer, especially with Australian 78s. Like, you'd have to be pretty delusional if you thought that a series of rare recordings of Australian political speeches recorded by the Columbia Graphophone Company in 1929 in Sydney had the same commercial prospects as a reissue of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, which actually reached #1. Weird, I know. And yet this is what archives seem to assume when they charge ridiculously high ridiculously high usage fees for commercial use of archival sound recordings. And these policies do that little to support the wider dissemination and appreciation of Australia's early sound history. Instead, they just serve to keep this culturally important material under lock and key, out of sight and out of mind. But why isn't more work being done to reissue our recorded sound history? Why is it that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art merits lavishly produced exhibition catalogues like this one recently, when recordings of traditional and even contemporary Indigenous music are rarely given the same treatment or attention? Maybe the cultural work cringes at work here too. And it's an imperative that more attention be given by Australians, whatever broad concept that is defined under that. That's another paper or a whole book, in fact. Australian researchers, historians, musicologists, authorities and institutions just to invest more in our sound legacy and our music output in general, and also that of our neighbours. This is especially important in the era we live in, where audiovisual materials and recordings are so ubiquitous, we just simply take them for granted. And we have forgotten the wonder that these technologies elicited in people when they were first introduced, like the films of the Lumiere brothers. And I'm sure you might have heard of that film of the train just coming forward and the audience is being so startled. And early reviews of the Lumiere films even proclaimed that cinema will be a means where death will cease to be absolute, which is quite a powerful concept. Like, you can see someone, you can hear them, but they're not alive. So it's just important that we remember that recorded sound is an active and living history, that concept of actually hearing the past, that they're portals to the past as objects, as carriers, as sound carriers. And they're a time and place captured and set in Set walls, not stone, shellac. But an important thing to remember about that time and place concept is that applies particularly to 78s because they were all recorded. There were no overdubbings or multi-tracks. It was just, you put the cutter down, and it goes into the wax disc, goes to the end, that was it, that was the tape. That moment captured in time. So that's a very special thing about 78s, I think, in general. And recorded sound keeps track of where we've been in the past, but can also point to where we're going. And the job of the collector and curator is to fish out these objects from obscurity and reintegrate their sounds, stories, and songs into the fabric of the present in a way that makes sense. As we've seen through the work of Harry Smith, this can be an incredibly transformative and powerful process on a massive scale, more than we probably realise, to literally see a country, well, America, changed through music. And it made perfect sense in this process to seek the mentorship of and partnership of historian and performer Warren Fahey, a living example of the process I've described as a self-proclaimed folklore recycling unit. And I'm currently and at the moment I'm working with this Rouseabout Records label to reissue recordings, digital reissue recordings. Whether or not they're going to actually have a physical release is another discussion. Featuring a range of content including blackface saxophone bands, Hawaiian-style crooners, obscure bird imitators, rare Maori recordings of Maori music by Maori vocalists, zany comedians, and the list goes on. And it's important to remember that so far that sound recordings has been a largely physical legacy. And what sort of cemented that in my mind today was the visit to the NFSA and them saying, well, sound recordings aren't going to have a physical future. So it's even more important that we preserve what we have over the past 100 years or so, or close to. And even though I identify as a collector, I realise that obviously no one can really truly own a sound recording or an object. At best, we're just guardians or merely carriers. And the writer William S. Burroughs succinctly articulated these anxieties in the title to his LP compilation of his famous cut-up experiments, which was released in 1981. And the phrase he used, which was also in the tape recordings he made, was, "Nothing here now but the recordings." And this is a phrase that rings particularly true for the research and work that I'm trying to do. Because with the inevitable passage of time, as people die or live and die, as sounds appear and reappear, appear and disappear, all we have are the traces, the recordings. But unlike Pygmalion, we can't bring these people back to life and their voices and talents. But we can preserve the legacy of what was recorded and what has survived, even though there are so many precious sounds that have been lost to us forever, for better or worse. And the words of Burroughs will always continue to pick away at me, and sort of motivating me to recognise why I collect and why I curate, to bring sense to the chaos, to understand my place in it, and to piece together what remains. And in the words of T.S. Eliot in the poem The Wasteland, these are the fragments that I've shorn against my ruins. And these are the fragments that we have left. And there's nothing here now, according to William S. Burroughs. Nothing here now but the recordings. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Now, I want everyone to ask Michael a question, but downstairs at afternoon tea.
Yeah.